Lieber Herr Marx.
Mr. Marx, thank you very much for your kind introduction. That already made it worthwhile to come here. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for the invitation to this beautiful hall, and thank you very much for attending my presentation on the topic Exhausted Society, Exhausted Children. I'm a children and youth psychiatrist in Hamburg at a large clinic, and that's one of the biggest children's hospital of Hamburg. So let's start out with the presentation. So maybe we can have a discussion later on. The topic of exhausted society, burnout, that's a buzzword. Few of you probably doubt that exhaustion is one of the phenomena we've dealt with very intensively over the last 10 years. We had to deal with this topic, and why I'm here today is I want to point out that exhaustion has reached children and adolescents, and it is a topic I deal with in my clinical work every day. The current developments, this is from a magazine, a slide from a magazine, the development of profitability, how they developed and how this will develop. You've probably heard Industry 4.0. It's about big data, automizing processes, and that are so intertwined that they optimize each other. You've heard about cost-benefit analysis, and this is part of this process, the social framework conditions that we're confronted with every day. Me too, I work for a company. The hospital I work at is a company. We're proud of being a successful company, but this also means that my board of directors expects that I contribute to the profitability of the hospital. And we wonder what would happen if my hospital is overtaxed, and every department there's at least one child too many compared to the number of beds we have. So I have to ask the board of directors, what if I cannot contribute to that profitability because we don't have enough beds? So far, they always told me that, well, I will probably come up with a new idea, but children in Hamburg, I'll never run out of children to treat, but the ethical problems, of course, are tremendous. And this fact that we're confronted with questions of profitability in the health sector is quite difficult. If you look at private hospitals, the situation is much more dramatic, and profitability requirements are much higher, which means that sometimes the departments don't even have nurses anymore, and have people working there that don't speak German. Ms. Steffen, I was very grateful for the Frankfurt Declaration because in the context of cost-benefit analysis, we also have to be aware of ethical aspects, and we have to wonder what we want as a society. We're all confronted with an increasingly complex world. Jürgen Habermas wrote a book about the new complexity of the world. He dealt with this topic in his book. Everybody is confronted with this issue every day. Just dealing with your email every day and finding systems of dealing with these things, that's something I struggle with every day. Everything I've tried out so far didn't work that well. And Mr. Kern already mentioned earlier one thing that you're familiar with. It's the schedule of this Congress. Why did I include this in my presentation? Well, because with regard to the topic of exhaustion, I thought that it's incredible that the range of topics that you deal with, the topics you bring along from your daily work, and how you try to communicate that. This is in line with my experience with cooperating with the police in Hamburg. And it is my impression that the time of playing blame games is over. 20 years ago, we blamed each other for children running away and getting lost, and those times are over. Now we have reached a very reassuring and professional level of cooperating. And as a society, I think we've reached a point that we can be very happy about. And I very much appreciate our cooperation with the Hamburg police. I visit the police on a regular basis, carry out trainings, and I believe this is a development that we must be aware of. There's a lot of positive things and efforts, and yet it is surprising that burnout is still so much of an issue. Current figures show that burnout among grown-ups is not increasing, but the AOK figures from 2011 show that the number of employees missing work due to exhaustion syndromes has increased between 2004 and 2010, but there are also other phenomena such as the bore-out syndrome, people who feel like they don't have a challenging work. Among the generation of 18 to 29-year-olds, there are a lot of people who say that they are able of so much more than they're required to do, and 47% of these people have muscle tension problems that must be treated. So there is a large number of figures. I just selected a few of them. Those who want to go to a clinic for exhaustion, 70% of those feel very exhausted. The topic of burnout is not an official established diagnosis. The International Classification of Diseases by the World Health Organization did not include this syndrome in its diagnosis, but we must not be misled by this, because there are a lot of exhaustion syndromes. There's a tension between adjustment and being overtaxed, and there's a discussion about burnout being, a problem among low performers. But that's not what the discussion is all about. It's not about saying people are oversensitive. 5 years ago, I thought that children suffering from burnout syndrome were especially sensitive and weren't resilient enough. But on the other hand, you have to be aware that every person can suffer from burnout. It's actually a method of torture. If the requirements are high enough, anyone will develop a burnout syndrome. So this can happen to any one of us. And it's not a new phenomenon. It was described in the Bible. There's a quote from the Bible: "You will become tired, you and your people." George Cheney in 1671, he was born in 1671, and he described the English malady, which affected predominantly young girls from higher groups in society that were exhausted and that had to undergo rehabilitation measures. And there's this method called Brownianism with different methods that were applied to strengthen these girls, and we must not be misled. This is not a disease that affected the higher parts of society, but these people actually were the only ones who had access to medical treatment. There is a diagnosis describing exhaustion symptoms. Neurasthenia, and this, however, applies to people who are not able to meet requirements fast enough. That's why this diagnosis is not used for burnout, to describe burnout syndrome anymore, because it sounds a bit depreciating. Graham Greene wrote a novel in 1960 where he describes an architect who suffers from depression, exhaustive depression. It's called A Burnt Out Case. That's the title of the book. And in 1974, the American psychiatrist and psychoanalyst Herbert Freudenberger, he realized that he was suffering from burnout himself. What does this mean clinically? I'll present to you a case, a concrete case. Anna, 16 years old. She comes to my office with her mom. She's a pretty tall girl with long blonde hair, nice clothes, a bit too much makeup, but at the same time she's very curious and shy. When I ask her why she's here and whether she came to the right person, she hesitates and looks at her mom. She doesn't really know, she says, because she wonders what this appointment is all about. When her mom scheduled the appointment, she was okay with this, but now that she's sitting in front of me, she feels like this is a bit too much and exaggerated. And I ask, what's exaggerated? I ask what was different when the appointment was scheduled a couple of weeks ago. If you looked at Anna at school or in the street, you wouldn't think that she is looking for psychological help. I know from my own experience that you can't tell just from looking at someone whether they have psychological problems. Anna strikes me in that she is very low-key, and so she seems very, very normal. Her makeup looks like a mask and reinforces my first impression that she's making an effort. But this effort doesn't relate to my work with her, but I become aware that in me, she triggers her own emotions. So I work with a girl who tries to be inconspicuous, and yet I realize that she really is making an effort. Anna starts to cry. She seems to be desperate. She becomes insecure, looking at her mom, looking for a reaction in her mom, and I tell her that it's not about shame, but that she must tell me why she came to me. Of course, I tell her that she needs to take her time and in how far she wants to answer my questions, and I tell her that I'll ask some questions to her mom as well. Anna relaxes and reports to me that she's going to 11th grade, and all of her time in school she's always been worried about her school performance, although there's no reason to be worried. She's always been a good student, and this is still the case. In elementary school, school was still fun. In middle school and high school, her performance didn't decrease, quite on the contrary, but for more than 1 year she's not only worried about her performance, but she's studying even more and more. She says that she has to make an effort because if she doesn't pass her A-levels with a really good grade, she won't be able to choose from a wide range of subjects to study. She's very diligent about starting to study for tests, and her parents support her. But recently they've told her to step down her efforts. But that wouldn't really help, she says, because her parents don't have to go to university. She says she's not exaggerating. She's not that smart. She has to work to be successful. For a few months, she's had trouble sleeping, trouble focusing and concentrating, and sometimes she has these crying fits. Then she's really desperate and angry at the same time. Every night she's laying in bed and feeling tired, exhausted, of course, as well. But as soon as she starts laying down, she starts pondering about whether she studied enough, and she's afraid that her efforts won't be enough. She's thinking about her future, and at 1:30 in the morning, she starts looking at her watch. She has to get up, or she wakes up before 7 o'clock. She's very exhausted, the same feeling of exhaustion that she went to bed with. She's in a very bad mood in the morning, and she doesn't want to be talked to. She's standing in front of the mirror to put on her makeup because that is a very positive routine for her. She feels angry, she feels misunderstood by the entire world. She's unhappy about herself, and she can't get this thought out of her head about having to make an effort and having to do everything by herself. She's not meeting with her friends too much anymore. They don't try to take her along to parties anymore. Her social life has come to a halt. She doesn't have time for a boyfriend. Whenever somebody shows interest in her, she tries to fend that off because she wouldn't have enough time to study, and she believes that she's too stupid and too lazy. And sometimes she can see for a brief moment that she's trapped in a rat race. The more effort she makes, the worse it becomes. Now she's even had eating problems. She's lost her appetite, which increases the conflict with her mother. Her mother is afraid of her daughter becoming anorexic. That's why her mom won't believe Anna when she says that she's not hungry. When her mom says to her that she should eat more, it's just one more element adding to her exhaustion. Anna is a typical 16-year-old suffering from exhaustive depression. Right now, I treat about 2 patients with the same symptoms each week. They look like this. It'll usually start with a decline in concentration, a decline in general performance, performance at school, sleeping troubles, loss of appetite, loss of energy, sadness, a permanent state of exhaustion, which can result in these adolescents saying that they are depressed, and there's a risk of suicide as well. If that risk occurs, we have to keep them at the hospital. So it's about being able to intervene at the right time, but that's the classic development, the traditional development. So the question is what all these problems are based on. What's the background? It's a puzzle of different causes. There is not one single cause for these problems. We have to look at our recent past, which is still rooted in the consequences of the Second World War and the reconstruction in Germany. This time is represented by grandparents, actually. There's still a feeling of guilt and denial denial about debt that was accumulated during the reconstruction process. And these are not only collective phenomena, but they also can be felt within families. Parents feel like they are lost in a rat race, and these feelings are then found again in children and grandchildren. So they are passed on from one generation to the next. The grandparents probably didn't receive any treatment and passed on these problems. Then add to that a lot of causes that are rooted in the present. Our present is marked by a world that is shaped by profitability, by business, and families are trapped in a situation where it's always about more, having more, doing more. The economy dominates everything, and then we are surprised when kids start to want designer jeans. So having the latest clothes is turning into a value, and then our young shopping queens will turn into exhausted models looking for a sense of belonging and a sense of purpose in their lives. So there's not a problem with the offer, but with the demand. And instead of doing something, we're leaning back and observing the situation, observing our children being completely exhausted. Families are companies where everything has to work. A maximum level of organization. If something doesn't go as planned, it's basically a disaster. Parents make their best efforts to do everything they can for their children. They have very high demands vis-a-vis themselves and their children, but reading all this literature that they read, parenting guides and so on, just makes them more insecure. But being at a loss isn't really something good when you want to help your children. We're in a complex world. We want democracy and peace and prevention and the best for all children. And on the other hand, we're confronted with destruction and a reemergence of the Cold War. It seems like we want to furnish proof that we're not able to live peace, and this has an effect on our children who are traumatized worldwide. They feel like all these efforts will be pointless, but efforts are a cause of burnout syndrome. In this environment, in the environment that we can influence directly, it is the moms that make the effort to reconcile their family life, their professional lives. They want to help their children harness their talents, and these mom logistics are then followed by mom tutoring, and without our mother's work, we would be lost. And the work done by moms isn't honored. Moms actually live burnout syndrome, and children observe that. And this drives the rat race in the children's heads. And then the dads go to work every morning, gratefully. Around our kids, we've seen the emergence of a digital world. And this digital world has our children sitting breathlessly in front of smartphones and tablets, where children document with their selfies that they're pretty. And we as grown-ups have created an environment where digitalization is a part of our children's lives, and we cannot abolish these media anymore because we use them all the time as well. However, it is our task to teach our children how to deal with this media and how to use this media. And yet, in our time, families remain a place of mutual love, a place where we don't see the daily destruction in our world, but parents are increasingly burned out and they transfer this feeling onto their children. And childhood needs school. School should be a place of learning and happiness, but we're so far from this that we're actually failing. Demotivated children report to me every day about teachers that tell children that they are responsible for their own success, but when these children reach high school, they are convinced that having a not excellent grade in their A levels would be a disaster. 5 years ago, I treated the first burnout kids in my hospital. Children who worked 50 hours a week to obtain a good grade in their A levels. My patients are becoming increasingly younger. In the final years of elementary school, they are so stressed because they want to go to Gymnasium, the highest school form in Germany. And what they learn is that they're alone in their efforts to become perfect. And the teachers don't really applaud the children enough for their performance. And at that point, at the very latest, the children will start believing that they will never be good enough, no matter what effort they make.
And I'm deliberately using the term our children because we as a society stand by and watch and don't do anything. Our pedagogical approach is one of disappointment and of the destruction of self-confidence, which decisively contributes to children burning out in contact with burnt-out teachers, not to forget. So taken together, it's the performance principle, the maximum performance with maximum economization reaching the latest and last realm of the family life, going along with a pedagogy dating back to the Middle Ages, making sure that burnout has become the phenomenon of our times. So who's surprised by this being consistently transferred to children? That was the attempt of summarizing this puzzle on the chart here. Then on the other hand, our children remain confronted with statements like this here. What formerly was done with a head is done by computers these days, smartphones, organizers and navigation devices, sat-navs. If we outsource our brain work, the memory dies off, nerve cells die off. The consequences are reading and attention deficits, anxieties, sleeping disorders, depression, obesity and readiness to use violence. That development is concerning and requires, especially for children, a reduction of consumption in order to counteract digital dementia. And you can already tell who wrote this, Manfred Spitzer in FAZ, and you can only contradict this. I won't quote this any longer because I've quoted it so often. But of course, all of this is not true. And unfortunately, I have to say, Mr. Spitzer is a psychiatrist for adults. And his empiric experience with children is N equals 4, which is the amount of his own children. Now, without suspecting him of anything as regards the development of his own children, but there is no indication whatsoever that this truly happens, what he's describing here. That's got something to do with what our children experience every day, in which nothing new either. And that is that we meet our children with a deficit-oriented point of view. And I have two more quotes on that. One says, our youth is without manners. Young people don't listen to their parents anymore. The end of the world is near. You can tell it's not a current quote. It's slightly antiquated, but you wouldn't get how old it is. It's from Ur Chaldea 2000 before Christ. And also the next one, it's not really from today. It says, I've no hope for the future of our country. Once our young people are the men of tomorrow, our youth is intolerable, irresponsible, and terrible to look at. That was nobody else but Aristotle, who said this. So what I'm saying, there is a phenomenon amongst adults which seems to be enrooted in mankind. If as an adult you look at children, you have the feeling that they're getting ever worse. They're getting ever more spoiled. They're getting ever more I don't know what. And that really exists across all generations. We're doing it currently with the digital world and the smartphone generation, saying, oh, hang on, they have holes for brains in the future. They won't be able to think anymore. If that was true, and if these quotes were true, then all of us would have long ceased to exist. So from that alone, you can see that this cannot be quite true. The next few quotations are a bit more current, so I'll skip them. Children, however, react to this, and you don't have to read all the details of what's up on the screen here right now. It's just to illustrate how a 14-year-old creates a mind map about Japanese history after 1860. How creative. A mind map is a method which I, as a student, never learned, which is highly creative, though, and highly sensible. How to understand complex circumstances, how to make them visual for yourself, how to learn them, therefore. That is how children react these days. And childhood certainly has changed a lot. The guys in the top left picture and top right picture that are the last remaining great-parent generation, some of whom are currently facing trial in Lüneburg, so Nazi youth. And top left, that was still orderly behavior at school in the 1920s. So quite a dramatic change has taken place, which is wonderful. It's wonderful how children have developed since then. But looking at it from a global scale, then childhood obviously is also subjected to entirely different requirements. These are 3-year-old girls being casted. That's actual abuse. That is instrumentalization of small children, which exists in the US, of which parents make great money. That's one aspect of it. These are UNICEF pictures that received an award in 2013. By the way, the photographers are listed below. What also is part of our world is a photo like this here. A 9-year-old girl in the foyer of the Aleppo hospital. You can see the blood stains on the floor, and she's very fearful, holding her father's hand. We in Hamburg are currently treating, or I have a lot of work with 1,300 minors traveling unaccompanied. It's usually young men and boys. So the extent of traumatization around the world is quite incredible. And of course, we've got to globally take care of it. And this too is childhood today. Normal childhood in Germany looks a bit like this here. My impression is we have wonderful kids who, as young people, look after their grandparents. And of course, they're looking at phenomena such as, can I be your friend on Facebook? Or can I be your friend, says the one girl, and the other says, on Facebook or for real. So that's as they live today. But if there's something you can rely on, it's that they are conservative in their values. They all want family, a home, and a car. Actually, they don't want a car any longer. That's no longer true. But they might still want family and a car-sharing system. But the wish for a family will never change. And also the young people we treat as inpatients, they are like these girls here who initially look as though all they ever do is tap into their smartphones. But if you talk to them, they are highly reflective and highly accessible and simply wonderful persons. And the fact that on the left bottom picture, the grandmother says, your grandmother has reading glasses now, and her grandchild says, and what do you do with them? That is obviously a humorous way of depicting it, and which might not be all that necessary to make it through life, as we always tend to believe. And that brings me to the end. I am convinced that also our children, just like us, want to be people who help improve our world, remain it, keep it peaceful and worth living in, and I'm convinced they're going to do a better job than we are. Thank you very much. Do you have a bit of an encore? Well, my encore, says Professor Markwort, would be, my idea is always to trigger debate. I'm not opposed to good performance, to striving for good performance. I'm performance-driven myself, and I like children to be clever and performance-oriented. I still think we need a debate as to what kind of values we want to convey, and a debate as to what type of pedagogical approach with what type of teachers and what type of schools, and I mean physical buildings with that. Because I go to schools a lot, and sometimes I'm terrified at how desolate, how in how bad repair these buildings are, and I often wonder how you are supposed to work in them, and I think it's really asking a lot of the teachers. And at our annual Congress in Munich in the spring of this year, we always look for risk and protection factors for child development, and we've jointly had to identify a new risk factor, which is school atmosphere. The school atmosphere has become an evidence-based risk factor for developing psychological disorders. And I have the impression that in Germany, the dialogue between teachers and parents is something which simply doesn't work. Often I have children telling me, understandably, that something's wrong with the teacher, the mother sitting next to the child, and ask me what to do. And I say, go to the teacher, try talk to the teacher, talk to each other, and immediately the child will say, oh no, please don't, mum. I'll have to suffer the consequences. This suspicion alone is so terrible. I mean, imagine children, if they don't feel treated well by my doctors in the clinic, they complain to me or somebody else. But they rather decide not to do this because they think they might suffer from it in the later therapy. That's a terrible, terrible suspicion. And that's not because teachers are always that horrible, but it's also because of the allocations, the things that we kind of portray into teachers. But nevertheless, mobbing certainly hasn't become any less at schools, and sometimes I'm really shocked at how little teachers feel responsible for the social atmosphere within a class. But often they tell me we're not trained for it, which I tend to believe. But nevertheless, I believe we need a different type of coexistence here, of dealing with each other. We need the school as a place of appreciation and respect. I often experience that too when students go abroad for a year or a term, which many students in Hamburg do, and when they return and I ask them what was different, they say, oh, in the UK when I did something wrong, the teacher would come and apologize because apparently he hadn't explained properly. If I tell that story in Germany, it sounds like a joke, and apparently it is, because we always presume if a child performs poorly, it's the child's mistakes and not the mistake of the one who tried to teach him something. And that's the kind of debate I'd be very happy to trigger and initiate in order to generate a broader public for it. That is why I wrote this book. Mr. Schulte-Markwort, my question, so entering into a debate about this, whether to do that right now here in front of an audience. Mr. Schmitz is also a pediatric doctor from Hamburg, and I think the two of you know each other. Yes, we do, confirms Professor Markwort. And Mr. Mark says, the DPC is now 20 years old, and when Mr. Schmitz was here for the first time, must have been ages ago. You've been here since the 4th, okay. And I remember the criminal police colleague who said, that's what I thought, cradle to grave, that's prevention. Now that's your idea of prevention. Now they come in and want us to probably do something about babies and prevention. I mean, hello, what's babies? We talk to expecting mothers at risk about prevention. And since then, the two of us have always been discussing, oh, it would be nice to have a pediatric doctor here as a guest. So now we have one. What do you think? What can we do in terms of prevention, crime prevention, health support, addiction prevention, wherever we work? How can we support you, and how could you maybe come to us more often? Could we organize a conference together maybe? The answer, well, that's the sign of the times, really, networking in the best of senses, since there are so many good offers, so many good things which often simply don't know about each other. And as for our discipline, that of child and youth psychiatry, is one where simply we need to talk more to each other, and there's nothing to be said against organizing a joint conference. And by the way we see ourselves up there, that's the logo of our department. It's small people and big people. And our clinic is right next to Bayersdorf, who make this kind of strips, plaster strips, and the blue thing below is the Elbe River, since we're in Hamburg. So that's how we see ourselves. And relationships, that's how everything works. And I'm very happy to have made an acquaintance with you here now, and let's make this the beginning of a long, wonderful friendship.